In the past, I've made some pretty cool things. I've made a folding sword, a suit of armor, a resin axe, and even a bow and arrow. But today, we're making something a little bit different. We're going to be making a Lego katana. What I mean by that is I'm just going to make a sword in the shape of the Lego katana, because apparently they're actually very different than a normal katana. I mean, for one, look at the size. It's as big as a minifigure, and it's not as bent as a katana, which I realized when I was making this. But I'm not going to make it exactly like a Lego sword. I'm going to change it slightly. I'm going to make it a little shorter, and also, if you look at the Lego one, the whole thing is the same material. I am going to be adding a handle, and it's going to be made of wood. So I drew the blade out on this steel rod and went to cut it out. Unfortunately, I couldn't make the blade as bent as I'd like it. It'll do, it's almost the same as the sword, but a little bit too straight. Anyway, I went to cut it out and we ran into the first problem. So normally I use a different type of cutting disc on my grinder, but when I went to the shops they'd sold out, so I bought a different brand. And after cutting 5 centimeters into the blade, half the disc was already gone. So I had to switch to a sanding disc, which isn't an issue because I've used them in the past on my previous builds. I only needed 2 and it got the job done. The only problem with it is it creates quite a bit of waste. If I was cutting the metal off, I could have used the metal in future projects, but since I'm turning it into dust, it just gets thrown out. The whole process of cutting out the shape of the blade didn't take too long, only took 1 or 2 hours, but it's not done yet as we're not going to sharpen it till the very end. But we are going to put it aside and move on to the next part, and that's the handle. For the handle, I'm going to be using Jarrah. Jarrah is my favourite wood, it's a nice colour and easy to work with. So to start with, I cut 2 pieces the same length, and then I put one aside for later while I grabbed another piece, traced out the shape of the tang. What's a tang? Well, this is a tang. It's in knives and swords. If your sword doesn't have a tang, it's actually quite dangerous, as the tang is what holds it in place in the handle. Make sure the blade's safe and secure in the blade. What? Now, in order for the sword to be super safe, the tang has to fit perfectly into the handle. Now to do this, I just grabbed a chisel and a hammer and went at the wood. It wasn't too hard. This actually took quite a long time though. I think I spent like 3 or 4 hours just hitting the wood. Mind you, first time I've ever used a chisel, and I was very scared of cracking the wood, which you'll see what happens later. Once I'd finished chiseling away the shape I needed, I went and got my drill and drilled 3 holes in the handle. Now these 3 holes would normally have pegs. Pegs normally go into the sword which hold it in place, but I'm not quite sure what to do, so I just used nuts and bolts. After I drilled the holes in the first piece of the handle, I had to make them line up perfectly with the other piece. At first I grabbed a pencil and tried to fit it through the hole, but it wasn't wide enough to think of another way, and I thought I was a genius for this. I went and got 3 nails, hammered them into the holes. I would then pull the nails out, and there'd be a little mark left on the wood showing me where I needed to drill. After doing this, I realised I could have just held the 2 pieces of wood together and then drilled, but I figured that one out a little bit too late. So I'm not smart, I'm just an idiot and gave myself more work, but oh well. Oh, I also drew holes into the blade as well, so then it could fit in the handle. And this is what it looks like now. It looks pretty bad. In fact, it more looks like a Minecraft sword because of the square handle. And this is where we move on to the next part. We're going to turn this into that. Sorry, quick side note, apologies if you can hear birds in the background. They're singing right now. It's actually quite nice. Anyway, back to the video. I had to be careful when I was sanding away the handle shape because I didn't want to sand too deep and accidentally sand into the part where I'd carved out earlier. Now I want the handle to be nice and smooth, so I'm going to have to drill a little bit extra into the handle so then the bolts and the nuts can sit there without affecting your grip. So to do this, I went and found the correct size, drilled 3 more little holes until the bolts sat flush. I went and grabbed the other piece of the handle and had to drill a little bit deeper because the bolts were a little bit thicker. Once that was done, there was just one thing to do, and that was to cut the bolts so then they didn't poke past the handle. Most guards on a katana are actually circular. My green one is a bad example of this because it's supposed to look fancy and cool. If you have a look at the Lego crossguard, it's a square. So that's what we're going to do, we're going to make it square. There's also this guard on the old Lego katanas. Personally, I think they're the coolest, but because they don't do them anymore, I'm just going to do mine square. Now, luckily from my last project, this right here, I had a little bit of leftover wood that was the perfect size to be the guard. So I went and grabbed that plank, drew out the square, started cutting it out, and then when I was almost finished cutting it out, I realized I made a mistake. You see, I need to cut this piece of wood in half to make it thin enough to be the guard. This would have been super easy if it was still on the piece of wood, but to save time and materials, I'm just going to keep using this piece. I'll just chuck it in the vise and cut it the long way, which took a very, very long time. This is probably what took up most of the time on the project. Mind you, I did have to keep stopping because the saw kept falling apart and I kept having to put it back together. It's an old saw. I don't know why that was happening. Anyway, but we weren't out of the woods yet because I snapped it. When I was almost done, it snapped because the vise was clamping together. I cut too low and the clamps just broke it. But that's okay. We still have the other piece, the piece I was actually going to throw out. It's still usable, so I'm just going to quickly remove the rest of the wood off it and we'll just use that. Now, in order for the crossguard to actually fit onto the blade, we're going to have to remove this little rectangle. To do this, we're going to drill a bunch of holes in it and then chisel the rest out. And this is where my chiseling didn't go well. I may or may not have been hitting it a little bit too hard and it exploded. Yeah, not fun. But it's still usable. I grabbed both pieces, removed all the excess wood I didn't need, and later on, when we finish the whole sword, we'll just glue it on. It should work. Actually, quick side note. Jesus, I sound stupid. Actually, quick side note. Right now it's drying, so I don't know if it's worked yet. Fingers crossed it does. Yeah, it's just drying in the corner over there. Now there's just one thing left to do before we can assemble the whole sword, and that's sharpen it. I went and grabbed the metal, clamped it to the table, and started sharpening it. Last time I sharpened a sword, it didn't go too well. I kind of messed it up, but I did learn a little bit, so this time went way better. And I may have made a bit of a mistake. You see, normally I wear a long sleeve, and today I forgot it. I left it at home, and I didn't think much of it until this happened. That was me burning my arm. You see, the sanding disc was spinning on it for so long and so fast, it heated up, got really hot, I leant over to move it, and seared my arm. This is what it looked like then. This is what it looks like now. Hurt quite a bit. Oh well, lesson learned. Besides that, sharpening went really well. From my last project, I learned two things. One, how to sharpen a sword properly with a grinder, so I guess it's not properly. And two, that after you sharpen it, you need to cover it in something, otherwise it's going to rust. Unfortunately, it rusted a little bit. I kind of salvaged it. I doused it in WD-40 and that seemed to do the trick. For those of you who don't know, you actually need to cover your swords in oil. Usually you use gun oil or other types of oil. You see, normally I would just cover it in WD-40 and call it a day with this sword. But because there's no sheath, that's the outer coating of the sword, there's nothing to keep the oil from drying up. So instead, I went and grabbed this clear coat primer and sprayed it with that instead, which was the best thing I could have done because it did two things. One, protected the sword, and two, it changed the color and made it look awesome. I don't know how well you can see it on camera, but it looks way better now. After that dried, it was down to the last thing, and that's assembling it. Putting it together was super easy. I mean, it doesn't look hard. This is the best I've ever done for pieces fitting perfectly though, which I'm very happy about. After assembling it, I just had to glue on that crossguard. I used PVA wood glue, quickly glued it on, and left it to dry. Alright, so the glue job worked really well. One problem, there's a little bit of paper stuck on top, so we're just going to quickly sand that away. You can still see it a little bit, but that's okay. Now it's time to compare it to both a real katana and a Lego one. But before that, let's just have a look at it by itself. Looking at it, I think it looks great. It looks like a sword. You can clearly tell it's meant to be a katana, which I guess isn't too hard. But there's one problem. It doesn't look like it has a bend. So I went and got this piece of metal and held it next to it. And you can tell there's a little bend. Not as big as I'd hoped, but next time we'll just have to get a thicker piece of metal. Side by side, you can clearly tell which katana is bent more. But one thing I did accidentally, which is perfect, is the handles are the same length. I don't know how I managed to do that. Now, when looking at it next to a Lego katana, they actually look really similar. I did a great job. One thing I could have done is carved the handle to make it look more like a Lego one. I'm not going to because I'm a little bit scared of damaging it or cracking the wood, especially now since I put the crossguard on as well. But is it really a sword if it can't cut? The final test will be seeing how sharp it is. Now, from watching other sword channels, they just cut pool noodles. So I went and got a pool noodle. If you have a look at this katana that I've been showing throughout the whole video, this is a display one. The blade is completely blunt and it will not cut the pool noodle. So I have two other things to compare it with. One is this long sword. I know it's not a katana, it's my only sharp sword that's as big as a katana. And two is this knife. When cutting with the knife, it was a bit weird to get through, kind of hard to get through the whole pool noodle. And then we switched to the long sword. Now, because I'm holding the pool noodle, cutting through it is actually quite difficult. The sword easily does it, it just gets caught right at the end and it won't cut through the whole thing. Now, this is where it blew my mind. It cut it way easier than my other sword. Like, forget about the fact it cut all the way through and the other one didn't. Just starting off the cut was so much easier with mine. But like, you can grab the blade, it doesn't feel that sharp, but it cuts really well. So that's a Lego katana in real life. I hope you liked the video, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.